All right, hello and welcome everyone. Today we start talking about war. I don't know if you can tell my voice is bad, as you'll probably hear later in class. So I'm going to give the first lecture on war today and post it, and then post the second one along with the lecture on unemployment tomorrow. Bad allergies, not making my voice that great right now. Okay, so I decided to start with this quote by Kenneth Clark saying, "It is a lack of confidence that kills a civilization. We can destroy ourselves by cynicism and disillusion just as effectively as bombs." So one of the things that I try to do in this class is to present you with the sort of doom and gloom scenarios, which are very real, but also to get you to think about possible solutions. And I'll have more to say about that as I introduce the final class project. So despite everything going on in the world today, if you become disillusioned and just become cynical, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then, society will sort of fall apart. However, if you take a more proactive, assertive stance towards these problems, then I think we can work towards some solutions. War is, something that has been with humanity for a long time. It's been one of my primary areas of expertise in terms of my scholarship. I started out by studying conflict, thinking about things like genocide, and I've kind of come back around to studying war once again, and militant, militaristic attitudes that lead to wars. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So this philosopher, Bertrand Russell, some of you may be familiar with him. I like his definition of power. He says the fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense that energy is the fundamental concept in physics. The laws of social dynamics are laws which can only be stated in terms of power. So in some ways, this gets at that conflict theory we were talking about, where if you really want to understand society, sometimes you need to look and see where the power is and who holds the power and who doesn't. Sometimes that can be a more fruitful way to analyze society than perhaps a functional view, where you're just sort of seeing how the parts kind of work. So when we talk about power and we talk about this sort of fundamental aspect of human nature, so to speak, I think it helps to look at those our nearest relatives in the animal kingdom. Some fantastic and fascinating work has been done in primatology in recent years. Primatology, the study of primates. Well, back 20, 30, 40 years ago, if people talked about culture in primate groups and in the monkeys and apes and so on, people would have thought that was crazy. You can't talk about culture. Culture is, a human thing, or tool use. That's a human thing, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, we're finding that that's not necessarily the case, that we do find instances of what we would consider culture or tool use amongst various primates. Our closest relatives are the chimpanzees and the bonobos. So it's very interesting, if you're interested in this stuff. Frans de Waal, as you can see, is kind of the big name, big scientist here in the study of primates. And what we have found over the last few decades of research is we're kind of right in between the chimpanzee and the bonobo. So the chimpanzee is known for its aggression. In that sense, it's sort of hierarchical societies. It's bands of sort of hunting, gathering, almost societies, and so on. What is kind of interesting about chimpanzees, though, is you don't see them ever really cooperating. No two chimpanzees would think to, if they wanted to move some log out of their way, would think, I'll grab this end, you grab that other end. Chimpanzees just don't cooperate. Bonobos, to some extent, seem to. They do to a certain degree. Bonobos are famous for, they're kind of like what 1960s hippie counterculture, people kind of aspired to be, the bonobo. Bonobos basically have a lot of sex. They use sex to, work up an appetite. They use sex to celebrate after eating. They use sex to, they just do it a lot. And they're non-monogamous, and they're not necessarily heterosexual either. So bonobos are kind of an interesting primate group as well. And so humans were kind of in between. I'm not going to go through this a lot, but just to kind of show you some of the differences. So gaze, following, food sharing, cooperation, social play, all those things that we think of in terms of civilization, kind of normal sort of behavior of a civilized group. We also, when we look at chimpanzees, greater tool use, causal reasoning, so they can, understand cause and effect better, spatial memory, and for important for our purposes today, aggression. So we see a lot of aggression, more aggression coming from chimpanzees. So, we're in that respect, we're closer to chimpanzees. So if we want to kind of understand, aggression within our species and so on, may help to look at our closest relative and their levels of aggression. So our aggression today, comes in the form of destroyed cities. And so the city of Aleppo in Syria, you can see the huge differences. If you want to see a great sort of look at the culture before the wars happened in Syria, they show bizarre foods with Andy Zimmern. He goes around the world eating different types of food. He goes to Aleppo, and this is probably 2009 or so. A bustling city, lots of people, lots of stuff going on, and today it's pretty much in ruins. As you can see here, that's the same street before and after the war. I lived in California for a number of years. The picture on top, it looks like it could be a street in Los Angeles or, San Diego or something. So again, we see, these effects, these effects of war, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And also recognizing that, in the midst of war in the midst of chaos and war, there's also opportunities. And so I'll talk a bit about some of these opportunities that have come about. Okay, my connection as well. Okay, so I think I maybe mentioned this before, I believe. Joshua Green, one of the things he does is trolleyology, does experiments and looks at people's brains as they do the trolley experiment. This sort of divide between us and them, insiders, outsiders, and so on, is pretty fundamental to our species, and it's not something we can easily get away from. What changes, though, is what we consider us and them, and we can discuss this in greater detail in the weeks to come. But looking more broadly, looking more at the global level is what I want to kind of focus on. We live in this age of the last few hundred years where it's basically been sort of the Anglo era, Anglo meaning the sort of English sort of tradition era. The British Empire, went around conquering various parts of the world for quite some time. Now the United States has sort of assumed that basic role. And we're living during a time of, really tremendous change happening at the global level. And the big thing right now, of course, is the sort of potentially brewing conflict between the United States and China. It is not predestined. There's nothing to say that it must happen, but there are a lot of things to be concerned about. I think actions both by China and by the United States that I think at the end of the day are going to be self-defeating for both countries, considering how symbiotic our relationship is. I often tell my students when we talk about global trade, how many of you would be willing to pay a few $100 more for your phone? if it's made in the United States rather than in China. And, something like 5% are willing to do that usually when I poll this question. So again, it's a relationship that's not easily broken, and maybe it shouldn't be, given the challenges facing the world. Regardless, these two powers do need to learn how to respond to one another. Now, it just happens to be a philosopher from China who's, I think, has provided some of the most fundamental key insights into war itself, into conflict. Sun Tzu, whether he was a real person or this is a compilation of writings is unclear. I'll just talk about him as if he was a person. So Sun Tzu basically, he kind of, one of the most important points he makes is that, the best way to win a war is not to get in one in the first place. And if you have to get in one, you want to minimize the amount of destruction. You want to use deception if you have to, and so on and so forth. So Sun Tzu provides all sorts of sort of interesting insights into war, into conflict. One thing that's kind of interesting is that Sun Tzu is read at the very high levels of government in both the United States and Britain, as well as presumably China. The Trump administration in particular, I think, there's one of his advisors who has Sun Tzu as his license plate on his license plate. There are other notable fans who will tweet Sun Tzu Art of War quotes quite often. One of the things I often will say that, liberals probably need to start reading The Art of War if they want to start winning elections. Because it seems like the sides that do read The Art of War tend to do better in elections. Okay, going back to some other older thinkers, I should say Sun Tzu, these writings go back, thousands of years. So this is, very, very ancient wisdom we're talking about here. More modern times, a few hundred years ago, you have Machiavelli. Some of you are probably familiar with the term, maybe not the person. So Machiavelli was a jurist. He worked for a number of nobles in Italy in the 1500s during the Renaissance era, which turned out to be a very violent, sort of almost abnormally violent period in not only Italy's history, but in world history. And so he's observing some of this, and he writes this book, The Prince, and he's basically writing about how a ruler takes power and holds on to power. And they have to do it through deception by, divide and conquer, divide up your enemies, make them fight each other, that sort of thing. In order to hold on to power, they need to rule through coercion and fear, manipulation, all of these things. So we often, describe people who are manipulative as being Machiavellian. If you remember, then the last lecture, a couple lectures ago, when we were talking about trolls, and they scored high on Machiavellian traits. These are manipulative traits coming from Machiavelli. Well, there's been research about people in modern societies who have Machiavellian attitudes. And they've looked at them in companies and in government. And what they find is kind of interesting. They find that they don't rise in the ranks very well. They generally get paid less. They're respected less. They're generally more isolated. This one study coded the strategies of U.S. senators by their facial expressions, whether they looked upset or happy about a bet bill and so on and so forth, whether they were being manipulative, that sort of thing. They found that those who were more Machiavellian got less support in Congress and less respect than their peers did. Now, this doesn't mean that, just throw away The Prince. Machiavelli doesn't have anything interesting or useful to say. No, he does. And we find in many organizations, you find that Machiavelli does have insightful things to say. In a world especially that is moving away from a world based on transparency, openness, that sort of thing, to a world that's more autocratic, then you should read The Prince, if not to be Machiavellian, to be aware of the Machiavellian world. So one of the people who's done this research sort of disproving the Machiavellian argument is this Dr. Keltner. He also was the advisor for the movie Inside Out, the Pixar film, which is about brain chemicals and stuff. He has this great quote: "We gain power by advancing the welfare of other people, and yet when we feel powerful, it turns us into impulsive sociopaths, and we lose those very skills." And so he's talking about simple experiments done all the way up to government and so on. A key figure in sociology is a guy named Max Weber, one of the most sort of expansive thinkers probably in human history. Really did a lot of research spanning a whole range of different areas. And he comes up with a definition of the government, of the state, that I think is really crucial. And it's probably one you don't learn in, like a high school social studies class about what the government is, maybe a body that makes rules or something like this. Weber gets at it more fundamentally. And he says the government, or the state, is basically this organization that has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a territory. So what does that mean? Basically, it means, let's look at it this way. You have a territory, a physical geographic territory. There's two groups. One group has all the guns, the other doesn't, but the other group is called the government. They make these laws and so on and so forth, but they just don't have the guns. It doesn't take too long before that group that has the guns takes over the government and becomes the sort of military dictatorship, which 1 out of 6 wealthy millennials are okay with, evidently, in a recent poll that I saw. 1 out of 6 wealthy millennials, which is not a big group. Well, we've been screwed twice now by economic collapse, but 1 out of 6 of the few wealthy millennials, would like to see a military dictatorship, which I find kind of alarming. So anyway, this group, the government, has the power over police and military and so on. And for the most part, the public then accepts that it's okay for the government to have that power. Most people would prefer the government to have, power over military forces rather than, say, Walmart or something like that. The decisive means for politics is violence. I think this is really, again, a key thing that people don't always understand. At the heart of politics is violence, is power. And, to hold on to power, people go to great lengths and, commit a lot of violence in order to hold on to power. So I think that's, again, something that we have to understand, that politics is not just this simple, kind of debate society where, whoever wins over the most people gets to govern and so on and so forth. That has been how democracy has worked. Democracy is a system that has not lasted long historically. It's something that we have to work and, try to hold on to and fight for, that sort of thing. Okay, well, how do structural functionalists, how do they see war and terrorism? Well, they see it as basically, from this sort of clinical, unsentimental view, they see war and terror as a way in which to maintain group boundaries, reinforce social norms, that sort of thing, maybe stabilize a society by mobilizing them militarily, that sort of thing. Because the fact of the matter is, war and terror have been sort of at the heart of, governmental development. So there's this fantastic book by Asimeglu and Robinson, and before this book called The Narrow Corridor: States, Societies, and the State of Liberty, The Fate of Liberty. Their last book was called Why States Fail, about governmental collapse. I'd recommend reading it for, some reason today. So this newer book, though, they kind of look at different societies, how they've managed security and liberty and that sort of thing. What I really like about this book is that most books that talk about liberty really talk about it from an American standpoint or a European standpoint, whereas this book goes all over history, all over the world, looks at how different societies have sort of regulated themselves, their economies, liberty, and so on and so forth. One of the key things that they point out, though, is that, and this goes back to this social scientist named Charles Tilly, war makes states and states make war. That a lot of times, a lot of governments and civilizations have developed by centuries of conflict and the development over centuries of, building up war, military capabilities, and so on. And throughout history, you see societies have different ways of permitting their own citizenry with certain powers to prevent revolutions, essentially. So, for example, in ancient Greece, there was something called the hubris law, where if someone basically, made fun of, publicly made fun or humiliated a child or somebody who wasn't as powerful in society. It could be a woman or a slave or something like this. The hubris law was a way in which the wealthy or the more powerful could be checked. They couldn't just, go after anybody. I think that's kind of interesting, especially today when we see very powerful people on Twitter just, attacking private citizens who don't have as much power. Maybe we should consider bringing back the hubris law. Okay, looking at the world we live in now and why, and thinking about war and conflict in the current period. Back in 1989, you had this book that was written, this article that was written that was later turned into a book by this guy, Francis Fukuyama. And this is when the Soviet Union falls. Communism falls apart. The Berlin Wall breaks down, which had separated East Berlin from West Berlin, East Germany, West Germany. The East was communist, the West was capitalistic, democratic, and so on. So during this time, we see Francis Fukuyama develops this very famous theory. He calls it the end of history. And he says we've reached the end of history. Doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen. Rather, we've reached the end of good ideas when it comes to thinking about types of government and types of economy. So he basically says that free market capitalism is the ideal form of government. It is the ideal form of the economy. And then liberal or representative democracy is the ideal form of government. And he said that basically now most societies are going to move in these directions. They're going to move from maybe a former communist society to a democratic capitalist society. And we call this the end of history. Well, it didn't really turn out that way. In a lot of ways, a lot of the world did go in that direction, but we've seen a lot of the world become very nationalistic. We've also seen plenty of countries that have not become democratic, and so on. A few years ago, we saw this argument by a guy named Steven Pinker, a psychologist. He wrote this book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. I highly recommend it. It's a great book, whether you agree with its conclusions or not. But the data is pretty clear, where we do see that murder rates, a lot of conflict rates have fallen quite dramatically in most of the world. And it's really quite a stunning thing. When we look at wars, for example, we can see this. This is looking at battle deaths, and you can see that most of the battle deaths have been civil conflict happening within countries. That happened within the 1940s as well as interstate conflict, so that would be wars, essentially. So as you can see, we see this decline in the 1940s, 50s. You've got a lot of World War II happening. You also have this big civil war happening within China, and so on and so forth. You get to the 60s, you have Vietnam, a lot of conflicts happening in parts of in parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Asia. 1980s, especially down in Latin America, you see a lot of conflict and so on. But you see this clear decline, and we've been seeing much fewer conflicts this century. Pinker has a more recent book that he argues makes this case even more broadly. Excuse me. Causes his most recent book is called Enlightenment Now, where he basically says actually a lot of things are getting better. Human health, despite coronavirus, on most measures is getting better in most places. In a number of areas, and we'll talk about this when we talk about unemployment and so on. But there are questions about how long this can last, and will we go back into a more violent world? So one of those more pessimistic views comes from a political scientist who died a number of years ago. His name was Samuel Huntington, and back in I believe the early 1990s, he writes this book called The Clash of Civilizations, and basically he says, okay, the Cold War has ended. He doesn't, he's not optimistic like Francis Fukuyama that it's, we're all going to be just free marketeer, liberal Democrats, that sort of thing. I don't mean liberal Democrats like the Democratic Party in the United States, but, Democrats in favor of democracy around the world. He saw the world sort of breaking down into older tribalisms. And so he says, okay, this world is going to break down into this sort of, these different civilizations, and they're going to clash against each other. And he's, as you can see, kind of laid out what he saw as being the main civilizations. And he says these can change over time, and so on and so forth. But he says we're probably not going to see, wars between European countries anymore. It'll be between Western Christendom and the Hindu world, or the Muslim world and Western Christendom, that sort of thing. And perhaps not surprisingly, this book went, shot to the top of the charts after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And so a lot of people were reading it then and thinking, okay, we maybe have reached that moment of a clash between, the Muslim world and the West, that sort of thing. Some people say maybe we're going to see a clash between the West and China, East Asia, that sort of thing. And we still could, still could see many different types of clashes of civilizations. There have been a number of critiques that have been written of his approach. One of the big problems with his Clash of Civilizations narrative is that it tends to ignore diversity within civilizations. So by far most of the people who are killed by, say, Islamic jihadist terrorists are not people in Europe, not people in the United States. They're people in Islamic countries. They're other Muslims. Most of the people that you're seeing that are killed by, say, white supremacists are not, white supremacists in the United States killing, people in Africa or people in Asia. They're killing people in the United States. They're killing non-white people in the United States. So, again, there's a lot of conflict just within countries. There's a lot of diversity within civilizations as well, and that's generally not really given much attention in the Clash of Civilizations. It also ignores global connections. So his theory was developed in a time when the world was much less connected. Now we're really hyper-connected, and we have relationships and friendships and families strewn across the world in ways that was almost unthinkable 20 years ago, 30 years ago or so when he wrote this book. Again, it doesn't matter that we won't see it. We have a world of sort of multiculturalism and, diversity within civilizations, but we also still have a very nationalistic world where, at the end of the day, majorities within nations generally tend to be fairly nationalistic. So maybe something to think about, that you can discuss. We can discuss in class next week or on Packback next week. What do you think about his Huntington? What do you think about Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis? Do you think that there will be a clash of civilizations? Do you disagree with it? I'll leave it with you. I'll be uploading the second part of the War and Conflict lecture, probably later today, maybe after our class. Otherwise, I'll upload it tomorrow morning. Well, I will see you later then.